Jake Morrison stood at his front door and looked out at his ranch. The sight made his heart heavy. Snow covered everything like a white blanket that would not go away. It was March 1887, but winter still held the Montana land in its cold grip. The wooden fence posts leaned at wrong angles. Some had fallen completely. The barn roof had holes where the heavy snow had broken through the old wood. He counted his cattle in the far field. Only 12 animals moved slowly through the snow, looking for grass that was not there. Last fall he had owned 30 head of cattle. The harsh winter had killed 18 of them. Their frozen bodies lay buried somewhere under the snow, waiting for spring to reveal the full damage. Jake pulled his worn coat tighter around his thin body. At 35 years old, he looked much older. His brown hair had gray streaks that had not been there 3 years ago. Deep lines marked his face around his blue eyes. His hands were rough and cracked from the cold and hard work. 3 years had passed since Mary died. She had been trying to give birth to their first child when both she and the baby passed away. Jake remembered that terrible winter night when the doctor shook his head and said there was nothing more he could do. Since then, Jake had worked the ranch alone. The loneliness ate at him like a slow poison. The ranch house where he lived was small but had once been warm and happy. Mary had made curtains for the windows and planted flowers by the front steps. Now the curtains were faded and torn. No flowers would grow where Mary had planted them. The house felt empty and cold, even when the fire burned bright in the fireplace. Jake walked to the kitchen and opened the wooden box where he kept his money. Inside were 2 silver dollars, some small coins, and 3 paper bills. He counted it all carefully. $23.47. That was everything he had left in the world. The bank in town had already sent him 2 letters about the money he owed them. If he could not pay soon, they would take his ranch away. He had tried everything he could think of to save the ranch. Last summer, he had worked for other ranchers, fixing their fences and helping with their cattle. But the work did not pay enough. He had sold his best horse, his wife's jewelry, and even some of his furniture. Still, it was not enough money to keep the ranch going. The kitchen table where he sat had been Mary's favorite place. She used to sit there in the morning, drinking coffee and planning her day. She would talk about the garden she wanted to plant or the chickens she wanted to raise. Her voice had been soft and musical, like a song that made everything better. Now the table was covered with unpaid bills and empty plates. Jake made himself a simple breakfast of bread and the last of his bacon. The bread was getting old and hard. Soon he would have no food left at all. He ate slowly, trying to make the meal last longer. Outside, the wind howled around the house like a wild animal trying to get inside. After breakfast, Jake went outside to take care of his animals. The 12 remaining cattle needed hay, but he was running low on that too. He broke the ice on their water trough with a heavy stick. The ice was thick and hard to break. His hands hurt from the cold, even through his worn gloves. The work took him most of the morning. When he finished, he sat on a log near the barn and looked around at everything he might lose. This ranch had been his dream since he was a young man. He had worked for 5 years to save enough money to buy the land. Then he had spent 3 more years building the house and barn with his own hands. Mary had helped him plan every part of it. The nearest town, Clearwater, was 15 miles away through rough country. Jake did not go there often because the trip took most of a day on horseback. But today he needed supplies, and he hoped someone might have work for him. He saddled his remaining horse, an old brown mare named Bessie. She was not fast or pretty, but she was strong and reliable. The ride to town was cold and difficult. The snow was deep in some places, and Bessie had to work hard to get through it. Jake pulled his hat down low and wrapped a scarf around his face to protect it from the wind. The mountain peaks around him were covered in snow that would not melt until late spring. When he reached Clearwater, the town looked almost as sad as his ranch. Many of the buildings needed paint and repairs. The main street was muddy with melting snow and horse tracks. Only a few people walked around, all bundled up in heavy coats and moving quickly to get out of the cold. Jake tied Bessie to a post outside the general store. Inside, the store was warm and smelled like coffee and leather. As the owner, Mr. Peterson, was a heavy man with a thick beard. He knew Jake and always treated him fairly. "Jake Morrison," Mr. Peterson said when he saw him. "How are things out at your place?" "Not so good," Jake said honestly. "Lost most of my cattle this winter. I need some supplies, but I can only pay for a little." Mr. Peterson nodded sadly. "This winter has been hard on everyone. What do you need?" Jake bought only the most necessary things: a small bag of flour, some coffee, and a piece of salt pork. The total cost was $2.15. That left him with only $21.32. As Jake was leaving the store, he heard two men talking outside. One was a traveling merchant with a fancy wagon full of goods to sell. The other was a local farmer named Bill Crawford. "There's going to be a bride auction next week," the merchant was saying. "Men can bid on women who want to get married. Some of them are real pretty, and they know how to cook and clean and work hard." Bill Crawford shook his head. "I heard about those things. Most of the women are desperate or running from something. It does not seem right to buy a wife like you would buy a horse." The merchant laughed. "Right or wrong, it helps men who need wives and women who need husbands. There are a lot of lonely men out here and not many women. Sometimes you have to take what chances you get." Jake stood very still and listened to every word. A bride auction. The idea seemed strange and a little frightening, but he thought about his empty house and his failing ranch. He thought about the long, quiet evenings with no one to talk to. He thought about Mary and how much better everything had been when she was alive. Maybe this was the answer to his problems. A wife could help with the work on the ranch. She could cook and clean and take care of the animals. More than that, she could bring life back to the empty house. Jake had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone care about him. The merchant saw Jake listening and walked over to him. "You interested in finding a wife, friend? The auction is this Saturday in the town square. Starts at noon. You never know what kind of woman you might find." Jake nodded slowly. "How much do the women usually cost?" "Depends on what they look like and what skills they have. I have seen men pay anywhere from $5 to $50. But there are always some that go cheaper if they are older or not so pretty." That night, back at his ranch, Jake sat by his fireplace and thought about what he had heard. $50 was more money than he had, but $5 was possible. Maybe he could find a woman who would be happy to help him save his ranch and build a life together. It was a chance, maybe his only chance. He looked around his empty house and made his decision. On Saturday, he would go to the bride auction. He would take his $21 and see what kind of future he could buy. Saturday morning came with clear skies and cold air. Jake woke up early and prepared for the trip to town. He washed himself with cold water from the basin and put on his best clothes. His best was not very good. The shirt was clean but had been mended many times. His pants were worn thin at the knees. His boots had holes that he had tried to patch with pieces of leather. He counted his money one more time. $21.32. He put it all in a small leather pouch and tied it to his belt. Then he saddled Bessie and started the long ride to Clearwater. The town was more crowded than Jake had ever seen it. Men had come from ranches and farms all around the area. Some had traveled for days to get there. They tied their horses to every post and fence in town. The saloon was full of men drinking and talking loudly about the auction. Jake walked around the town square where the auction would happen. Someone had built a wooden platform in the center of the square. A man in a fancy suit was testing how loud his voice would carry. This was the auctioneer who would run the sale. Near the platform, Jake saw a large wagon with canvas sides. Through a gap in the canvas, he could see women inside. Some were young and some were older. Some looked scared and some looked determined. All of them looked like they had traveled a long way and had nowhere else to go. Jake felt uncomfortable watching them. These were real people, not cattle or horses to be sold. But he reminded himself that they had chosen to come here. They wanted husbands just like he wanted a wife. Maybe this arrangement would help everyone. More men kept arriving as the morning went on. Some wore expensive clothes and rode fine horses. These men had money and could bid high prices. Others looked like Jake, with worn clothes and worried faces. A few men were very old and some were very young. All of them seemed nervous about what was going to happen. At noon, the auctioneer climbed onto the platform. He was a short, round man with a loud voice and a big smile. "Welcome, gentlemen, to today's bride auction," he called out. "We have 12 fine women here today, all looking for good husbands. The rules are simple. I will bring each woman up here, tell you about her, and you can bid. The highest bidder gets to marry the woman if she agrees. All sales are final." The crowd of men pressed closer to the platform. Jake stayed toward the back because he felt shy about the whole thing. He could see everything, but he did not want the women to notice him staring. The first woman was young and pretty with yellow hair and blue eyes. She wore a clean dress and smiled at the crowd. The auctioneer said she was 18 years old and could cook, sew, and read. The bidding started at $10 and quickly went up. Men shouted out higher and higher numbers. Finally, a well-dressed ranch owner paid $35 for her. She seemed happy with her new husband. The second woman was older, maybe 30 years old. She had brown hair and looked very serious. The auctioneer said she had been married before, but her husband had died. She knew how to run a household and take care of children. A farmer with 3 young children bought her for $22. One by one, the women were sold. Jake watched each auction carefully, but the prices were all too high for him. The cheapest woman so far had cost $15, and that was an older woman with a bad cough. Jake's heart sank as he realized he might not be able to afford anyone. Then something strange happened. The auctioneer called for the next woman, but instead of a normal-looking person, a very tall figure came onto the platform. This woman was huge, much taller than most men. She wore a long dress that covered her from neck to feet. Most unusual of all, she had a brown burlap sack over her entire head and face. The crowd went silent. No one had expected to see anything like this. Some men laughed nervously. Others stepped back as if they were afraid. The woman stood very still on the platform, her hands folded in front of her. The auctioneer looked uncomfortable but tried to keep smiling. "This here is a special case, gentlemen. This woman was found wandering alone on the prairie about a month ago. She had no money, no horse, and no family that anyone could find. She cannot speak or will not speak. No one knows her name or where she came from." "Why does she have a sack on her head?" someone in the crowd shouted. "She refuses to take it off," the auctioneer replied. "We do not know what she looks like under there. She might be pretty or she might not be. She might be young or she might be old. But I can tell you she is strong. Look at the size of her. She could work like 3 regular women." Jake stared at the mysterious woman. Even standing still, she looked powerful. Her shoulders were broad and her arms looked muscular under her dress sleeves. Her hands were large but seemed to move with grace when she adjusted her position. "She has been staying at the church, helping with cleaning and cooking," the auctioneer continued. "The pastor says she works hard and never causes trouble. She just will not talk or show her face. Maybe the right husband can get her to open up." The crowd was not interested. Men whispered to each other and shook their heads. This was not what they had come to buy. They wanted pretty wives who would smile and talk and make their homes cheerful. This giant, silent woman with a sack on her head seemed more like a strange puzzle than a wife. "Let's start the bidding at $10, the auctioneer said, but his voice was not as confident as before. No one said anything. The crowd just stared at the woman on the platform. She stood perfectly still as if she could not hear what was happening around her. "Come now, gentlemen. $10 for a strong worker. Think of all the help she could give you on your ranch or farm." Still no one bid. The woman's head moved slightly, and Jake thought she might be looking around at the crowd through the sack. He wondered what she was thinking. Was she embarrassed? Was she sad that no one wanted her? Or was she angry at being treated like an animal for sale? "How about $5 then?" The auctioneer tried again. $5 for this strong woman. Someone must need help with heavy work. Jake felt sorry for her. No person should have to stand up there while a crowd of strangers decided if they were worth $5. He thought about his own situation. He needed help on his ranch, and he had been willing to pay much more than $5 for a wife. This woman might be strange, but she was still a human being who deserved kindness. The auctioneer was getting desperate. "Come on, men. I cannot let her go for nothing. Someone make a bid. Jake looked at his money pouch. He thought about his empty house and his failing ranch. He thought about the long, lonely nights with no one to talk to. Maybe this strange woman would not be able to talk back, but at least he would not be completely alone. And if she was as strong as she looked, she could help him save his ranch. Before he could change his mind, Jake raised his hand. $2, he called out. Every head in the crowd turned to look at him. The auctioneer seemed surprised but relieved. We have a bid of $2. Anyone want to bid higher? The crowd looked back at the woman on the platform, then at Jake, then back at the woman. No one else raised their hand. Jake was the only person in the whole town willing to spend even $2 on the mysterious giant woman with the sack on her head. Going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. He paused and looked around hopefully, but no one else spoke up. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $2. Jake's heart pounded as he walked forward through the crowd. Men stepped aside to let him pass, and he heard them whispering about him. Some seemed to think he was brave. Others seemed to think he was crazy. Jake was not sure which one was right. When he reached the platform, the auctioneer climbed down to take his money. Jake handed over 2 of his precious silver dollars. Congratulations, the auctioneer said quietly. I hope you know what you are doing. The woman stepped down from the platform and stood next to Jake. Up close, she was even taller than he had thought. The top of her head, even with the sack, came up to his eyebrows. She was broader and stronger looking than any woman he had ever seen, but there was something about the way she held herself that seemed dignified, like a queen who had lost her crown, but not her pride. Ma'am, Jake said politely. My name is Jake Morrison. I have a ranch about 15 miles from here. If you agree to come with me and be my wife, I will do my best to take care of you and treat you with respect. The woman turned her head toward him. Through the rough burlap sack, Jake could not see her face at all, but she nodded once, slowly and clearly. She had agreed to become his wife. Jake did not know what he had just gotten himself into. He had spent his last $2 on a woman whose face he had never seen and whose voice he had never heard. But as they walked together toward where he had tied Bessie, Jake felt something he had not felt in 3 years. For the first time since Mary died, he was not completely alone in the world. Jake stood next to his new wife and felt like he was in a dream. The crowd of men was already moving on to watch the next woman being auctioned. No one seemed interested in Jake and his strange purchase anymore. The woman beside him stood very still, her head covered by the brown burlap sack. He could not tell what she was thinking or feeling. I guess we should go, Jake said quietly to her. My horse is over there. The woman nodded and began walking in the direction he pointed. Jake noticed that she moved with surprising grace for someone so tall and strong. Her steps were careful and quiet, like someone who was used to not drawing attention to herself. When they reached Bessie, Jake realized he had a problem. He had not thought about how 2 people would get home on 1 horse. Bessie was strong, but she was also old. Carrying 2 riders for 15 miles would be hard on her, especially when one of the riders was such a large woman. Can you ride? Jake asked the woman. She shook her head no, which surprised him. Most people who lived in this part of the country knew how to ride horses. It was like knowing how to walk. This made Jake even more curious about where she had come from and what her life had been like before. Well, we will have to figure something out, Jake said. He looked around and saw a man selling supplies from a wagon. Wait here a minute. Jake walked over to the man and asked if he had any rope for sale. He bought 20 feet of strong rope for 50 cents. It was more money than he wanted to spend, but he had an idea. Back at Bessie, Jake used the rope to make a simple harness. I am going to ride Bessie and you can walk beside us. This rope will connect us so you will not get lost or left behind. We will go slowly so you can keep up. Is that all right with you? The woman examined the rope harness that Jake had made. She touched it with her large hands, testing how strong it was. Then she nodded her agreement. Before they left town, Jake stopped at the general store one more time. He bought a small bag of dried meat and some crackers with the last of his money except for $1. The trip home would take many hours, and they would need some food along the way. The journey began on the main road that led out of Clearwater. For the first hour, they made good time. Jake rode slowly on Bessie, and the woman walked steadily beside them. The rope connected Jake's saddle to a loop around the woman's waist. She seemed to have no trouble keeping up with the horse's easy pace. As they traveled, Jake found himself stealing glances at his new wife. Even with the sack on her head, he could see that she had an unusual way of moving. She walked like someone who was used to hard work, but also like someone who had been taught to carry herself with dignity. Her dress was simple and worn, but it was clean and carefully mended. Jake tried to start a conversation several times. "The weather is nice today," he said. The woman did not respond. "I hope you will like the ranch," he tried. Still no response. "My wife Mary used to love this time of year when spring starts to come." Nothing. After a while, Jake stopped trying to talk. Maybe the woman really could not speak, as the auctioneer had said. Or maybe she was just afraid or shy. Either way, pushing her to talk was not going to help. They stopped to rest and eat when the sun was halfway down the sky. Jake found a place beside a small creek where they could sit on some rocks and let Bessie drink water. He shared the dried meat and crackers with the woman, breaking everything into 2 equal portions. The woman lifted the bottom edge of her sack just enough to put food underneath it. Jake caught a quick glimpse of her chin and mouth. Her skin looked smooth and not too dark or too light. Her lips seemed normal-sized, not too thin or too thick. But the glimpse was so brief that Jake could not tell much else. While they ate, Jake watched how the woman behaved. She was very careful with the food, eating slowly and not wasting even the smallest crumb. She cupped water from the creek in her hands to drink, and her movements were neat and precise. Everything she did suggested that she was used to making a little food last a long time. "We should get going again," Jake said when they finished eating. "We still have a long way to go before dark." The woman stood up immediately and positioned herself beside Bessie. She was ready to continue the journey without complaint. Jake was starting to realize that whatever else she might be, his new wife was not lazy or difficult to work with. The second half of their trip was harder. The road became rougher and steeper as they got into the hills where Jake's ranch was located. The woman had to work harder to keep up, but she never asked to stop or rest. When they came to particularly rocky or muddy sections, she would hold on to Bessie's saddle to help herself along. As the sun got lower, Jake began to worry about reaching home before complete darkness. Traveling these mountain roads at night could be dangerous. There were holes and loose rocks that could hurt a horse or rider. There were also wild animals that came out to hunt after dark. "We are going to try to move a little faster," Jake told the woman. "Can you manage that?" She nodded and adjusted her grip on the rope. Jake urged Bessie into a slightly quicker pace. The woman had to trot occasionally to keep up, but she managed it without seeming to struggle too much. Just as the last light was fading from the sky, they reached the boundary of Jake's ranch. He could see the dark shape of his house and barn in the distance. Home had never looked so welcome to him. "There it is," Jake said, pointing ahead. "That is where we live now." The woman turned her head to look where he was pointing. Even though he could not see her face, Jake sensed that she was studying the ranch carefully. He wondered what she thought of it. The buildings were not large or fancy. The fences needed repair. Everything about the place showed that times had been hard. When they reached the house, Jake helped the woman down from the rope harness and tied Bessie to the hitching post. He would take care of the horse properly in a few minutes, but first he wanted to get his new wife inside where it was warm. Jake opened the front door and lit an oil lamp. The small flame pushed back the darkness and showed the inside of his house. He suddenly felt embarrassed about how it looked. Dishes were stacked unwashed in the kitchen. Clothes were scattered around the main room. The floor had not been swept in weeks. For 3 years, Jake had lived like a man who had given up caring about his surroundings. "I am sorry about the mess," Jake said. "I have not been keeping house very well since my first wife died. I hope you will not mind helping me make it nicer." The woman walked slowly around the main room, looking at everything. She touched the back of a chair, examined the cold fireplace, and looked at the stairs that led to the bedroom upstairs. Jake could not tell what she was thinking about any of it. Are you hungry? Jake asked. I could make some coffee and heat up some beans. The woman turned toward him and nodded. Jake was relieved to get some kind of response from her. He went to the kitchen and started building a fire in the stove. While he worked, he watched the woman out of the corner of his eye. She continued to explore the house slowly and carefully. She looked at the few books on Jake's shelf, touched the cold ashes in the fireplace, and examined the worn curtains that Mary had made years ago. Her movements were quiet and respectful, like someone visiting a church. When Jake had the coffee ready and the beans heating, he called the woman to the kitchen table. She sat down across from him, and they shared their first meal together in their new home. The woman ate carefully and politely, lifting the edge of her sack to take small bites. After dinner, Jake showed the woman upstairs to the bedroom. You can sleep here, he said. I will sleep downstairs on the couch until we get to know each other better. I do not want you to feel uncomfortable or afraid. The woman looked around the bedroom that had belonged to Jake and Mary. There was a large bed with a faded quilt, a wooden chest for clothes, and a small mirror on the wall. Everything was dusty and looked like it had not been used for a long time. The woman nodded to show that the arrangement was acceptable to her. Jake brought her some clean blankets and told her where she could find water for washing. Then he went back downstairs and made himself a bed on the old couch. As Jake lay in the dark, he thought about the strange day he had just lived through. This morning, he had been a lonely man with a failing ranch. Tonight, he was married to a woman whose face he had never seen and whose voice he had never heard. He had no idea if he had made a good decision or a terrible mistake. From upstairs, he could hear the woman moving around quietly. She seemed to be settling in for the night. Jake wondered if she was happy to have a home, or if she was scared to be alone with a stranger. He wondered if she would still be there in the morning, or if she would disappear in the night like she had appeared. But mostly, Jake wondered if two people who could not even talk to each other could ever build a real marriage together. Only time would tell if his $2 gamble would save his ranch and his life or destroy both. Jake woke up before sunrise on Sunday morning. His back was sore from sleeping on the old couch, but he had slept better than he had in months. For the first time in 3 years, he was not completely alone in his house, even with a stranger. Upstairs, the house felt more alive. He got dressed quietly and went outside to take care of Bessie and check on his cattle. The morning air was cold and fresh. Snow still covered the ground, but Jake could smell spring coming. In a few weeks, the weather would warm up and he could start the hard work of rebuilding his ranch. When he came back inside, the woman was already downstairs in the kitchen. She had built up the fire in the stove and was making coffee. The smell filled the house and made it feel warm and welcoming. Jake had forgotten how nice it was to wake up to coffee that someone else had made. Good morning, Jake said. Did you sleep well? The woman turned toward him and nodded. She handed him a cup of hot coffee and pointed to the table where she had set out some bread and butter. Jake was surprised by how thoughtful she was being. Thank you, Jake said. This is very nice. They ate breakfast together in comfortable silence. Jake found himself studying the woman's hands as she ate. They were large and strong, with calluses that showed she was used to hard work. But they were also graceful in the way they moved. These were not the hands of someone who had lived an easy life, but they were the hands of someone who took pride in doing things well. After breakfast, Jake decided to show the woman around the ranch. He wanted her to understand what kind of life they would have together and what kind of work needed to be done. They started with the barn, which was in bad shape. Part of the roof had collapsed from the weight of snow. Several of the wooden boards in the walls had come loose. The doors did not close properly, which let cold air in and made it hard to keep the animals warm. This needs a lot of work, Jake said as they looked around. I have been trying to fix it myself, but I cannot do everything alone. The woman walked around the barn slowly, examining the damage. She tested the strength of some of the loose boards and looked up at the broken roof. Then she picked up a hammer that was lying on the ground and hefted it in her hand. She swung it a few times, testing its weight and balance. Jake watched her with growing amazement. The woman handled the hammer like someone who knew how to use tools. She pointed at one of the loose boards and made a motion that clearly meant she wanted to help fix it. You know how to do carpentry work? Jake asked. The woman nodded and pointed to herself, then to the broken barn. She wanted to help repair it. For the next several hours, Jake and the woman worked together on the barn. She could not talk to tell him what she was thinking, but she communicated clearly with gestures and actions. When Jake needed a nail, she handed it to him before he asked. When he struggled to hold a heavy board in place, she stepped in to help without being told. Jake was amazed by how strong she was. She could lift boards that would have been heavy for most men. She could swing a hammer with power and accuracy. But she was also careful and precise in her work. Every nail she drove went in straight and true. By noon, they had repaired most of the loose boards and started working on the roof. The woman climbed up on the ladder like she had been doing it all her life. She was not afraid of heights or hard work. Jake began to think that buying this mysterious woman might have been the best decision he had made in years. They stopped for lunch and sat outside on a log near the barn. Jake had made sandwiches with the last of his meat and cheese. As they ate, he talked to the woman about his plans for the ranch. If we can get the barn fixed and the fences repaired, we might be able to buy some more cattle this summer, Jake said. I lost most of my herd this winter, but with two of us working, we could build it back up. The woman listened carefully to everything he said. She could not respond with words, but Jake could tell she was paying attention. Sometimes she would nod to show she understood, or point at something he was talking about. I used to have big dreams for this place, Jake continued. My first wife, Mary, and I planned to raise a family here and build a successful ranch. After she died, I kind of gave up on those dreams. But maybe with your help, we could try again. The woman reached over and briefly touched Jake's hand. It was the first time she had touched him since they shook hands at the auction. Her touch was gentle and warm, and Jake felt like she was trying to tell him that she wanted to help make his dreams come true. In the afternoon, they worked on repairing the fence around the pasture where the cattle stayed. This was even harder work than fixing the barn. They had to dig new post holes in the frozen ground and replace fence posts that had rotted or broken. The woman worked as hard as Jake did, never complaining or asking for rest. As they worked, Jake found himself talking to her more and more. Even though she could not answer back, it felt good to have someone to talk to. He told her about his childhood on a farm in Missouri, about how he had come west to Montana to start his own ranch, and about his life with Mary. Mary was small and delicate, Jake said as they set a new fence post. She could not do heavy work like this, but she made our home beautiful and peaceful. She could sing like a bird and cook better than anyone I ever knew. I loved her very much. The woman stopped working and looked at Jake. Even though he could not see her face through the sack, he felt like she was really seeing him and understanding what he was saying. I do not expect you to be like Mary, Jake continued. You are a different person, and that is all right. I just want us to be partners and help each other. Maybe someday we can be friends too. The woman nodded slowly and went back to work, but Jake noticed that she seemed to be working with even more energy than before, like his words had given her hope or determination. By evening, they had accomplished more work than Jake had done in weeks by himself. The barn was mostly repaired, and a long section of fence was fixed. Jake felt tired but satisfied. It had been a good day. As they walked back to the house together, Jake realized something important. The woman might not be able to talk, but she was definitely not helpless or useless. She was one of the hardest workers he had ever met. She understood what needed to be done and did it without being asked. If she continued to work like this, they really might be able to save the ranch. That night at dinner, Jake made a decision. He reached across the table and gently touched the woman's hand. I do not know your name or where you came from, he said, but I want you to know that I am glad you are here. You worked harder today than most men I know. If you want to stay and be my partner, I think we can build a good life together. The woman squeezed his hand gently and nodded. Then she got up from the table and walked to the kitchen window. She looked out at the barn they had repaired and the fence they had fixed. When she turned back to Jake, her whole body seemed to show pride and satisfaction. For the first time since the auction, Jake felt like his $2 purchase had been money well spent. This strange, silent woman might be exactly what he needed to turn his life around. He just hoped that someday he would learn who she really was and why she kept her face hidden from the world. As they prepared for bed, Jake felt something he had not felt since Mary died. He felt hope. Tomorrow would bring more work and more challenges, but for the first time in 3 years, Jake felt like he had a real partner to face those challenges with him. The woman went upstairs to her room, and Jake made his bed on the couch again. But as he lay in the dark, he could hear her moving around quietly above him. He was no longer alone in his house, and that made all the difference in the world. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. 2 weeks passed, and Jake's life changed in ways he had never expected. Every morning, he woke up to the smell of coffee and breakfast cooking. Every evening, he came home to a clean house and a hot meal. But most importantly, every day he worked, alongside a partner who seemed to understand exactly what needed to be done. The woman still wore the burlap sack over her head, and she still never spoke a word. But Jake had stopped thinking of her as a mysterious stranger. She had become his partner in every sense of the word. They worked together, ate together, and planned the future of the ranch together. Jake started calling her Grace in his mind, though he never said the name out loud. She moved with such grace and dignity that the name seemed to fit her perfectly. Even doing the hardest, dirtiest work, she carried herself like someone who deserved respect. Grace had taken over all the household tasks without being asked. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, washing windows that had been dirty for years and scrubbing floors until they shone. She organized Jake's scattered belongings and mended his torn clothes with neat, careful stitches. But Grace was not just a housekeeper. She was a full partner in running the ranch. She could fix almost anything that was broken. She could handle the cattle like someone who had been working with animals all her life. She seemed to understand horses and knew how to calm them when they were frightened or excited. One morning, Jake found Grace in the barn with one of his cows that had been limping for several days. The cow was lying down, and Grace was examining its injured leg with gentle, skilled hands. She had found a sharp piece of metal stuck in the cow's hoof and was carefully removing it. "How did you know how to do that?" Jake asked, amazed. Grace looked up at him and pointed to herself, then made motions like she was taking care of animals. She had learned this skill somewhere in her past life. Jake wondered what other skills she might have that he had not discovered yet. As the days passed, Jake found himself talking to Grace more and more. Even though she could not answer back with words, she was a good listener. She would nod or shake her head to show that she understood what he was saying. Sometimes she would gesture to show her own ideas or suggestions. Jake told Grace about his dreams for the ranch. He wanted to breed the best cattle in Montana. He wanted to build a bigger barn and a nicer house. He wanted to plant crops and maybe raise some sheep as well. Grace listened to all of his plans and seemed to share his excitement about the future. "If we can get through this summer without losing the ranch to the bank," Jake said one evening as they sat by the fireplace, "we might actually have a chance to make this place successful." Grace nodded enthusiastically and got up to fetch a piece of paper and a pencil from the kitchen. Jake watched in surprise as she began to draw. She was not just making random marks. She was drawing a detailed picture of the ranch as it could look in the future. Grace drew a larger barn with a weather vane on top. She drew new fences that were straight and strong. She drew fields planted with crops and pastures full of healthy cattle. She even drew a bigger house with a front porch and flower garden. "This is beautiful," Jake said, studying her drawing. "You are an artist, as well as everything else." Grace seemed pleased by his compliment. She pointed to different parts of the drawing and then to herself and Jake, showing that she saw all of this as something they would build together. That night, Jake lay on his couch thinking about how much his life had changed. 3 weeks ago, he had been a lonely, desperate man who was about to lose everything. Now he had a partner who worked harder than anyone he had ever known, who shared his dreams, and who seemed committed to building a future with him. The next morning brought an unexpected challenge. Jake woke up to find that 3 of his cattle had broken through a weak section of fence during the night. The animals were nowhere to be seen, and their tracks led off into the rough country beyond his ranch. "We have to find them before they get too far away," Jake said to Grace. "Those cattle are worth more money than I can afford to lose." Grace was already getting ready to help. She had found Jake's spare rope and was coiling it expertly around her arm. She pointed to the tracks and then to herself, showing that she was ready to help hunt for the missing animals. They saddled Bessie and set out to follow the cattle tracks. Grace walked beside the horse, studying the ground carefully. She seemed to be able to read the tracks better than Jake could. Several times, she pointed out places where the cattle had changed direction or stopped to graze. The trail led them through rocky hills and thick brush. It was difficult country to travel through, and Jake began to worry that they would not be able to find the cattle before dark. But Grace never gave up. She kept following the tracks even when they became hard to see. After several hours of searching, they heard the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. Grace pointed toward a small valley ahead of them, and sure enough, they found all 3 missing animals drinking from a stream. Getting the cattle back home was not easy. The animals were nervous and did not want to be herded, but Grace seemed to know exactly how to move around them and guide them in the right direction. She worked with quiet confidence, never rushing or frightening the cattle. By late afternoon, they had all 3 animals back in their proper pasture. Jake repaired the broken fence while Grace kept watch over the cattle to make sure they did not wander off again. "I could not have done that without you," Jake said as they walked back to the house. "You saved me from losing 3 head of cattle that I cannot afford to replace." Grace seemed pleased but not surprised by her success. She acted like helping him was the most natural thing in the world. That evening, Jake made a decision that had been growing in his mind for days. After dinner, he asked Grace to sit with him by the fireplace. "Grace," he said, using her name out loud for the first time. "I have been calling you that in my mind because of the way you move and carry yourself. I hope you do not mind." Grace tilted her head to show she was listening. "I know we have only been married for a few weeks, and I know this was not a normal way to meet and get married. But I want you to know that I respect you and appreciate everything you do. You are not just my wife. You are my partner and my friend." Grace reached over and took Jake's hand in both of hers. Her touch was warm and gentle, and Jake felt like she was trying to tell him that she felt the same way. "I do not know why you keep your face covered, and I do not know why you—" "Do not speak," Jake continued, "but I want you to know that those things do not matter to me anymore. You have shown me who you are through your actions, and that is enough." Grace squeezed his hand more tightly and nodded. Then she stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at the ranch they were building together, the repaired barn, the fixed fences, the healthy cattle. When she turned back to Jake, her whole body seemed to radiate happiness and determination. Jake understood what she was telling him without words. This ranch was becoming her home too. She was committed to making it successful, just as committed as he was. They were truly partners now, in every way that mattered. As they prepared for bed that night, Jake felt a contentment that he had not experienced since Mary's death. Grace was different from Mary in every possible way, but she had brought her own special gifts to his life and to their shared home. Jake no longer thought about the $2 he had spent on Grace as a desperate gamble. It had been the best investment he had ever made. Whatever secrets Grace carried from her past, whatever reasons she had for hiding her face and staying silent, Jake was grateful that fate had brought them together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and more hard work, but Jake knew that whatever came, he and Grace would face it together. They had become a team, and together they were stronger than either of them could ever be alone. As Jake fell asleep on his couch, he could hear Grace moving quietly in the room upstairs. For the first time in 3 years, his house truly felt like a home again. And for the first time since Mary's death, Jake felt like he had a real future to look forward to. 2 months had passed since Jake brought Grace home from the auction. Spring had arrived in full force, bringing warm days and the promise of new life. The ranch was transformed. The barn stood strong with its new roof. The fences were straight and secure. The cattle looked healthy and content in their green pasture. Jake and Grace had settled into a comfortable routine. They worked together during the day and spent quiet evenings by the fireplace. Grace still wore the burlap sack over her head, and she still never spoke, but their communication had grown so natural that Jake sometimes forgot she could not talk. On this particular morning in May, dark clouds gathered in the western sky. Jake could smell rain coming, and he knew it might turn into a serious storm. Montana spring storms could be violent, with high winds and dangerous lightning. "We should secure everything before the storm hits," Jake said to Grace as they finished breakfast. "The wind could damage anything that is not tied down." Grace nodded and immediately began gathering loose tools and equipment from around the ranch. She understood the danger of storms as well as Jake did. They worked quickly but carefully, making sure everything was safely stored. By noon, the wind was picking up and the sky had turned an ominous dark gray. Jake and Grace hurried to get the cattle into the barn where they would be protected from the worst of the weather. The animals seemed nervous and restless, sensing the approaching storm. The first drops of rain began to fall just as they got the last cow safely inside the barn. But these were not gentle spring raindrops. They came down hard and fast, driven by gusts of wind that made them sting like tiny bullets. "We better get to the house," Jake shouted over the noise of the wind and rain. Grace was securing the barn door when it happened. A sudden, powerful gust of wind caught the heavy wooden door and slammed it backward. At the same moment, an old wooden beam that had been loosened by their recent roof repairs broke free and came crashing down. Jake watched in horror as the heavy beam struck Grace on the side of the head. She collapsed immediately, her tall frame folding to the ground like a tree that had been cut down. The burlap sack flew off her head and landed several feet away. "Grace," Jake cried, running to where she lay motionless on the barn floor. For the first time since he had known her, Jake could see Grace's face. Even unconscious and injured, she was beautiful. Her hair was long and dark, almost black, with waves that caught what little light filtered through the barn. Her skin was smooth and pale, with high cheekbones and a strong but feminine jawline. But what shocked Jake the most was a long, pale scar that ran across her throat from one side to the other. It was an old scar, well healed, but it told a story of violence and pain that made Jake's heart ache. Jake gathered Grace in his arms and carried her to the house as quickly as he could. The storm was getting worse, with lightning flashing and thunder crashing overhead. Rain poured through holes in the clouds like waterfalls from the sky. Inside the house, Jake laid Grace on the couch and lit several lamps so he could see how badly she was hurt. There was a lump on the side of her head where the beam had hit her, and a small cut that was bleeding. But she was breathing normally, and her pulse felt strong. Jake had some experience with injuries from his years of ranch work. He cleaned the cut carefully and applied a cold, wet cloth to the swelling. Then he covered Grace with blankets and waited for her to wake up. The storm raged outside for hours. Lightning lit up the windows and thunder shook the house. Jake sat beside Grace, watching her breathe and praying that she would be all right. He had not realized until this moment how much she meant to him. The thought of losing her filled him with panic. As evening approached, Grace's eyes began to flutter open. She looked confused and disoriented at first, like someone waking up from a deep sleep. When she tried to sit up, Jake gently pressed her back down. "Stay still," he said, softly. "You hit your head pretty hard. You need to rest." Grace looked at Jake with clear, intelligent eyes. They were brown, he noticed, a warm brown like coffee with cream. But then something else registered in her expression. She reached up to touch her head and realized that her face was uncovered. Panic filled her eyes, and she looked around frantically for something to cover herself with. Jake reached out and gently caught her hands. "It is all right," he said calmly. "You do not need to hide from me." Grace stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. She touched her throat where the scar was, and Jake could see shame and fear in her expression. "I see the scar," Jake said gently. "But it does not change anything. You are still the same person who has been my partner and friend for these past 2 months. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she did not try to cover her face. For the first time, Jake could see her real emotions written clearly on her features. She was afraid, But she was also hopeful. Jake reached over and touched her hand. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked quietly. Grace opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out at first. She touched her throat again and winced, as if speaking caused her pain. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, she managed to say one word: "Elizabeth." The T sound was hoarse and rough, like someone who had not used their voice in a very long time, but it was the most beautiful sound Jake had ever heard. "Elizabeth," Jake repeated. "That is a beautiful name." Elizabeth tried to speak again, but the effort seemed to cause her pain. Jake could see her struggling with words that would not come easily. "My name is Elizabeth Thornton," she managed to say, each word an obvious effort. "Elizabeth Thornton," Jake said. "I am very pleased to finally meet you properly." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed to be tears of relief rather than fear. She had shared her real name with someone for the first time in months, maybe years. "You do not have to tell me anything else right now," Jake said. "You need to rest and let your head heal. We can talk more when you feel better." But Elizabeth shook her head. She seemed determined to say more, despite the obvious difficulty and pain. "I was, running," she whispered. "Bad man wanted to marry me." Jake listened carefully, his heart breaking as he began to understand what had happened to her. "Hurt my throat," Elizabeth continued, touching the scar. "Could not speak for long time." "You were hiding," Jake said, understanding beginning to dawn on him. "The sack over your head. You were hiding from someone who might recognize you." Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Afraid he would find me." Jake felt a surge of protective anger toward whoever had hurt this brave, strong woman, but he kept his voice calm and gentle. "You are safe now," he said firmly. "No one is going to hurt you here. I will not let anyone take you away or force you to do anything you do not want to do." Elizabeth looked into Jake's eyes, searching for any sign that he might be lying or that he might change his mind when he learned more about her past. But she saw only kindness and determination. "Thank you," she whispered. The storm outside was beginning to calm, but inside the house, a different kind of storm was settling. For 2 months, Jake and Elizabeth had been building a partnership based on work and mutual respect. Now, with her face revealed and her voice finally heard, they had the chance to build something deeper. Jake looked at Elizabeth's beautiful scarred face and felt his heart fill with an emotion he had not expected. This was not the same kind of love he had felt for Mary. This was something new and different, born from shared work and mutual respect, strengthened by the revelation of courage and vulnerability. "Rest now," Jake said softly. "Tomorrow we can talk more. Tonight, just know that you are home and you are safe." Elizabeth closed her eyes, but a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt truly safe. And for the first time since the auction, she allowed herself to hope that she might have found not just refuge, but a real home and a true partner. As Jake sat watching over her through the night, he realized that the woman he had bought for $2 had turned out to be worth more than all the money in the world. Elizabeth slept through the night and most of the next morning. When she finally woke up, the sun was streaming through the windows and the storm had passed completely. Jake was sitting in a chair beside the couch, reading an old book. He had not left her side since the accident. "How do you feel?" Jake asked when he saw her eyes open. Elizabeth tried to sit up slowly. Her head still hurt, but the terrible dizziness from the day before was gone. She touched the bandage that Jake had wrapped around her head. "Better," she said in her hoarse whisper. Speaking was still difficult and painful, but she was determined to try. Jake helped her sit up properly and brought her a cup of warm broth. "Drink this slowly," he said. "You need to get your strength back." As Elizabeth sipped the broth, she kept glancing at Jake nervously. In the daylight, without the burlap sack hiding her face, She felt completely exposed. She was not used to anyone seeing her real features or her scar. "You do not have to be afraid," Jake said gently. "I meant what I said last night. Nothing has changed between us." Elizabeth nodded, but Jake could see that she was still worried about something. She kept looking toward the door, as if she expected someone to come bursting through it. "Tell me about the man you were running from," Jake said. "Maybe if I understand the danger, I can help protect you better." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, gathering her strength and her courage. Then she began to speak, slowly and carefully, pausing often to rest her voice. "My father owns big ranch in Colorado," she whispered. "Very rich, very powerful man." Jake listened carefully, not interrupting even when Elizabeth had to stop and rest. "He arranged marriage for me," Elizabeth continued, "to man named Samuel Garrett. Very wealthy, but very cruel man." Elizabeth's hands shook as she remembered. Garrett liked to hurt people, especially women. "I heard stories about his first wife. She died in suspicious accident." Jake felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his expression calm. He did not want to upset Elizabeth more than she already was. "I told my father I would not marry Garrett, but father, he said I had no choice. Marriage would join our ranches, make him even richer." Elizabeth paused to drink more broth and rest her voice. Jake could see that telling this story was taking a lot out of her, both physically and emotionally. "Night before wedding, I ran away," Elizabeth continued. "Took my best horse and little money I had saved. Thought I could reach my aunt in California." "What happened to your throat?" Jake asked gently. Elizabeth's hand went automatically to her scar. 3 days after I ran, Garrett's men wife found me. They were bringing me back when we were attacked by bandits." Jake could hardly believe what he was hearing. Elizabeth had survived not just an abusive engagement, but also a bandit attack. "Bandits killed Garrett's men," Elizabeth whispered. "One of them held knife to my throat, demanded money. When I said I had none, he got angry and cut me." Elizabeth had to stop talking for several minutes. The memory was clearly painful, and her voice was getting weaker. "Thought he killed me," she continued, finally. "Bandits left me for dead. Somehow, I survived, but throat was badly hurt. Could not speak for many months." Jake reached over and took Elizabeth's hand. "How did you survive? How did you take care of yourself?" "Wandered for weeks," Elizabeth said. "Finally found small town. Doctor there helped heal my throat, but voice never came back completely." Elizabeth explained how she had worked in the town for several months, doing cleaning and cooking in exchange for food and shelter. But she was always afraid that Garrett or her father would find her. "Started moving from town to town," she said. "Always afraid someone would recognize me. That is why I covered my face." "How did you end up at the auction?" Jake asked. Elizabeth's expression grew sad. "Was staying with church in Clearwater. Pastor was kind man, but town was too small. People asked too many questions. When I heard about auction, I thought it might be way to disappear completely." Jake was amazed by Elizabeth's courage and determination. She had survived abandonment by her family, an attack that almost killed her, and months of living in fear. Yet she had never given up. "Thought if strange man bought me, I could work for him and be safe. Did not expect to find real partner. Elizabeth looked at Jake with tears in her eyes. You have been so kind to me. Kinder than my own father ever was. Jake felt his heart breaking for everything Elizabeth had been through, but he also felt incredible admiration for her strength and resilience. Your father and this Garrett man, Jake said carefully. Do you think they are still looking for you? Elizabeth nodded. Garrett is very proud man, does not like to be defeated. Father cares more about money than about me. They will keep looking. Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about what this meant for their future. If Elizabeth's enemies found her, they would not hesitate to take her away by force. Jake was just one man with a small ranch. Elizabeth's father and Garrett had money and men to help them. Are you afraid I will send you away now that I know the truth? Jake asked. Elizabeth nodded, fresh tears starting to flow. Thought you might not want trouble that comes with me. Jake moved closer to Elizabeth and took both of her hands in his. Elizabeth, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am not going to send you away. I am not going to let anyone take you away. You are my wife, and this is your home. Elizabeth stared at him in amazement. But you only married me because you needed worker. Now you know. I am fugitive. I married you because I needed a partner, Jake said firmly. And that is exactly what you have been. The best partner I could have asked for. Your past does not change that. Jake stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch they had built together. Besides, this is not just about what I owe you. This is about what is right. No woman should be forced to marry a man who will hurt her. No father should sell his daughter like a piece of property. When Jake turned back to Elizabeth, his expression was determined and strong. We will figure out how to keep you safe, but we will do it together. Elizabeth could not believe what she was hearing. For months she had been alone and afraid, never knowing who she could trust. Now she had found a man who was willing to stand up for her against powerful enemies. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk so much for me? Jake came back and sat beside her on the couch. Because you have given me back my life, Elizabeth. Before you came, I was just waiting to die or lose everything. You helped me save this ranch, but more than that, you helped me remember how to hope for the future. Jake paused, choosing his words carefully. And because I have come to care about you very much, not just as a partner or a helper, but as a person, I do not want to see you hurt or frightened ever again. Elizabeth felt something she had not felt in years. She felt loved and protected and valued for who she really was, not for what she could bring to a business arrangement. I cared about you too, she whispered. More than I thought possible. They sat together quietly for a while, holding hands and thinking about what the future might bring. There would be challenges ahead. Elizabeth's enemies might find her eventually. The ranch still needed a lot of work to become truly successful. But for the first time in years, both Jake and Elizabeth felt like they had found something worth fighting for. What do we do now? Elizabeth asked finally. Jake smiled at her. Now we keep building our life together. We make this ranch the best it can be. We watch out for each other. And if trouble comes looking for us, we face it together. Elizabeth smiled back, and Jake thought it was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. The scared, silent woman with the sack over her head was gone. In her place was Elizabeth Thornton, strong and brave and ready to build a future with the man who had seen her true worth when no one else would. 3 weeks passed after Elizabeth revealed her true identity. Her head injury healed completely, and her voice grew stronger each day. She no longer wore anything to cover her face, and she spoke more freely, though her voice remained soft and sometimes hoarse. Jake and Elizabeth fell into an even deeper partnership than before. Now that they could communicate with words as well as actions, they planned and dreamed together about the future of their ranch. Elizabeth had good ideas about raising cattle and managing money. Her education showed in the way she could read and write and figure numbers. The ranch continued to prosper under their joint care. The cattle were healthy and growing fat on the spring grass. The barn and fences were in perfect repair. Jake had even been able to buy 3 more head of cattle with money they earned from selling milk and eggs in town. But Jake could see that Elizabeth still carried fear with her every day. She looked over her shoulder when they went to town. She jumped at unexpected sounds. At night, she sometimes woke up from bad dreams about being found by her father or Samuel Garrett. One evening in early June, as they sat together on the front porch watching the sunset, Jake made a decision that had been growing in his heart for weeks. "Elizabeth," he said, "I want to ask you something important." She looked at him with curiosity and a little worry. "What is it?" Jake took her hand and looked into her brown eyes. "When we got married at the auction, it was not a real marriage. It was just a business arrangement between 2 desperate people." Elizabeth's expression grew sad, thinking Jake was about to say he wanted to end their arrangement. "But now," Jake continued, "I want to ask if you would marry me for real. Not because you need a place to hide and not because I need a worker, but because we choose each other freely, as partners and companions for life." Elizabeth stared at him in amazement. "You want to really marry me?" "I want to marry you because I love you," Jake said simply. "I love your strength and your courage. I love the way you work so hard to make our home beautiful. I love the way you care for the animals and the way you dream about the future with me." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too, Jake. I have loved you since the day you defended me from those men in town who said cruel things about my sack." Jake remembered the incident she was talking about. A few weeks ago, some men in Clearwater had made jokes about Jake's strange wife with the covered face. Jake had told them to mind their own business and show some respect. Elizabeth had never mentioned it before, but apparently it had meant a great deal to her. "Then will you marry me?" Jake asked. "Will you be my wife by choice, not just by circumstance?" "Yes," Elizabeth whispered, and then louder, "Yes, I will marry you, Jake Morrison." They decided to have their wedding the following Sunday. Elizabeth wanted to be married in the small church in Clearwater where she had stayed before the auction. The pastor there had been kind to her, and she wanted him to perform the ceremony. That week, Elizabeth did something she had not done in over a year. She went to the general store and bought fabric to make herself a wedding dress. It was simple white cotton, but to Elizabeth it felt like the finest silk. Jake bought himself a new shirt and had his one good suit cleaned and pressed. On Sunday morning, they rode into town together. Elizabeth wore her new white dress and had flowers in her hair that she had picked from the meadow near their house. Jake had never seen her look more beautiful. The church was small and plain, but it was filled with sunlight streaming through the windows. A few people from town had come to witness the wedding, including Mr. Peterson from the general store and Dr. Miller, who had helped treat Elizabeth's head injury. Pastor Williams, a gentleman with gray hair and kind eyes, performed the ceremony. When he asked Jake and Elizabeth to say their vows, they spoke words they had written themselves. "Elizabeth," Jake said, "I promise to stand by you in good times and bad times. I promise to protect you from anyone who would harm you. I promise to work beside you to build a life we can both be proud of. And I promise to love you for who you are, scars and all, for the rest of my life." Elizabeth's voice was clear and strong as she made her own promises. "Jake, I promise to be your true partner in all things. I promise to work hard to make our home a place of peace and happiness. I promise to stand by you through whatever challenges we may face, and I promise to love you with all my heart, because you saw worth in me when I could not see it in myself." When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Jake and Elizabeth kissed for the first time. It was a gentle, sweet kiss that sealed their commitment to each other and to their shared future. After the ceremony, the whole congregation celebrated with cake and lemonade in the churchyard. Elizabeth was nervous at first about meeting so many people with her face uncovered, but everyone was kind and welcoming. Several women complimented her dress and her courage. As the sun was setting, Jake and Elizabeth rode home to their ranch as a truly married couple. The house looked warm and welcoming with lamplight glowing in the windows. The barn stood strong and well built. The cattle grazed peacefully in their pasture. "It is perfect," Elizabeth said as they looked at their home together. "It is just the beginning," Jake replied. "We have a whole lifetime to make it even better." That night they moved Elizabeth's belongings from the small upstairs bedroom to the larger room that Jake had been sleeping in alone for 3 years. As they arranged her few possessions alongside his, Elizabeth felt like she was finally truly home. Over the following months, Jake and Elizabeth's love and partnership continued to grow stronger. The ranch prospered beyond their wildest dreams. They bought more cattle, planted their first crops, and even added some chickens and pigs to their farm. Elizabeth's voice grew stronger with use, though it never lost the slight hoarseness that reminded them both of what she had survived. She began to sing while she worked, filling their home with music for the first time since Mary's death. In September, wonderful news arrived. Elizabeth was going to have a baby. They were both overjoyed. At the prospect of starting a family together, Jake built a cradle with his own hands, and Elizabeth began sewing tiny clothes and blankets. One day in October, a stranger rode up to their ranch. Jake and Elizabeth both tensed, wondering if this might be someone looking for Elizabeth. But the man turned out to be a lawyer from Colorado with surprising news. Samuel Garrett had been arrested for the murder of his first wife. New evidence had come to light, and he was now in prison awaiting trial. Elizabeth's father, apparently feeling guilty about his treatment of his daughter, had sent the lawyer to find her and offer her a substantial inheritance, her mother's jewelry, and a sum of money that would ensure she never had to worry about finances again. "Your father wants you to know that he is sorry," the lawyer said. "He realizes now that he was wrong to try to force you into that marriage." Elizabeth listened to the lawyer's offer with a calm expression. When he finished speaking, she looked at Jake and then back at the lawyer. "Please tell my father that I forgive him," she said quietly. "But I do not need his money. I have everything I want right here." The lawyer seemed surprised by her response. "Mrs. Morrison, this is a considerable sum of money. It could buy you a much larger ranch, a finer house." "Sir," Elizabeth interrupted, gently, "you do not understand. I am not interested in a larger ranch or a finer house. I am interested in a home built with love and hard work. That is what my husband and I have created here together." Jake felt his heart swell with pride and love for his wife. She had the chance to be wealthy again, but she chose their simple life together instead. After the lawyer left, Jake and Elizabeth sat together on their front porch, watching the sun set over their land. Elizabeth's hand rested on her growing belly and Jake's arm was around her shoulders. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked. "Giving up your father's money, I mean." Elizabeth smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "Jake Morrison, you paid $2 for me at an auction, but you gave me something worth more than all the money in Colorado." "What is that?" "You gave me the chance to be valued for who I really am. You gave me a partner who sees me as an equal. You gave me a home where I am safe and loved. What could be worth more than that?" Jake kissed the top of her head. "Nothing," he said. "Absolutely nothing." As winter approached, Elizabeth gave birth to their first child, a healthy baby boy they named William. Elizabeth proved to be a wonderful mother, patient and loving. Jake was amazed by how naturally she took to caring for their son. The ranch continued to thrive year after year. Jake and Elizabeth eventually owned one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. But more than their financial success, they were proud of the life they had built together based on mutual respect, hard work, and deep love. Elizabeth never again covered her face or tried to hide her scar. She wore it as a badge of her survival and strength. The townspeople of Clearwater came to respect her greatly for her intelligence, her kindness, and her remarkable story of overcoming adversity. Years later, when William was old enough to understand, Jake and Elizabeth told him the story of how they met at a bride auction. William found it hard to believe that his strong, confident mother had once been so afraid that she covered her face with a sack.